My name is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're thrilled to have you all here tonight for this really important discussion. I don't want to spend too much time telling you about what's coming up, so I would just refer you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. You can see our full calendar of events there. We've been doing a fairly regular, robust schedule on Mondays and Thursday evenings for the last few months. And have a lot of stuff still planned throughout July and into August. So I would encourage you to check the calendar and join us for these future chats. We have a couple of things coming up that I would note on your calendar. June 25th, we have the wonderful author Britt Bennett, who's going to be with us for her new book. And we also have Colson Whitehead, who's going to be joining us on July 6th. So a couple of things to note there. But like I said, you'll see all those things on our calendar. I want to say welcome to our co-moderator for tonight, Nehemiah Frank, the editor of the Black Wall Street Times. We've had the great opportunity to collaborate on a few events over the last couple of years. As many of you know, last week was the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I believe our last event together was for the Tulsa 1921 book, and Nehemiah moderated that chat for us, and it was really great event, powerful evening. So glad to have him back. So we'll be co-moderating, kind of chatting back and forth. I want to invite you guys also to ask questions throughout. There's going to be hopefully time to get as many as we can. We're going to try to pepper those throughout the conversation instead of waiting till the end for every question. So we'll add those in as we can. So Nehemiah or myself will grab some of those and just throw them out there as we move forward. We could not be more pleased to have Eduardo Porter join us tonight. Eduardo is an economics reporter for the New York Times, a magazine or a newspaper rather that you've probably heard of before, and was even served, I believe, on the editorial board for a while. We had an event a while back, a few months ago. Time is a weird thing right now. It seems like a couple of months ago, where we were interviewing one of the current members of the New York Times editorial board about the Electoral College and some other things going on there. So a lot of people, I didn't even quite know what the inner workings of an editorial board at a newspaper were. So that was kind of an education for me. So thank you, Eduardo, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Tulsa virtually.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
Yeah. I guess before we kind of dive into too many details about the book, we would be remiss not to note the current climate that we're in right now. These books are written a long time before they come out. You know, there's a big process of the editorial process, the printing process, all that. You certainly had no idea what the world would be like when the book came out. Unfortunately, any book on this topic coming out pretty much at any time would be relevant. And I guess in some ways that's the saddest commentary of all. But we are particularly at a moment of a crisis right now. Do you have you had a chance to kind of reckon with this moment and how you're able to kind of lend your voice to this through the book?
I mean, as you suggest, I take no pleasure from the fact that my book appears relevant today with, police helicopters flying outside my window and protests about over the death of George Floyd. And I mean, of course, the book speaks to what's going on. And what's going on breaks my heart, right? I mean, what we saw in Minneapolis, what sparked protests around cities across the country, is just another instance of the kind of everyday brutality that the state believes it's okay to unleash upon Black Americans. But I wanted to say that American Poison, my book, doesn't really pretend to represent the pain of communities of color in the face of this violence. There are other voices out there that have done this kind of more eloquently than I ever could. What I aspired to do was to articulate how this racial hostility, the kind that allows a cop to kill an unarmed Black man in Minneapolis with the kind of bored expression of a plumber fitting pipe while his colleagues stand by, has really warped this country. since the birth of the nation. That's the purpose of the book. I think what we're seeing today, right now, kind of like raises it to the forefront. But I'm trying to take the argument beyond the immediate violence upon one community to just basically talk about and articulate how it has undermined the nation as a whole.
So just for those watching, the book is called, I'm glad you brought that up. The book is called American Poison, How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. And I'm interested, the term racism, right, gets used so much that I think people don't quite understand it. And what I liked about this is you use the term racial hostility. Can you kind of just dive deep into what that means in terms of just how you split that between the generalized word of racism, which we hear every day? Racial hostility seems like a different application.
That's really a great question. And I struggled a lot with what words to use. And where I came out is that the word racism is too narrow in a way. It denotes an immoral kind of hatred and contempt that on one hand is undefined, and on the other hand, it seems to me leaves out a variety of other feelings around racial and ethnic divisions. So when I use racial hostility, of course, that includes, hatred, contempt, bigotry, the kind of feelings espoused by white supremacists that do not believe that people of color should share an equal role in American society. But it also includes kind of like a lot of much more hushed, more banal, more routine sort of feelings, bigoted feelings that often go unrecognized, and I think that are not really quite well represented by the term racism. It's something that maybe I would encompass under the word tribalism, the sort of us versus them thinking that can manifest sometimes as fear, sometimes as mistrust, sometimes as contempt, sometimes as competition over spaces and resources. And I think a lot of communities, maybe all communities, espouse in some form this kind of racial or ethnic boundary thinking. And so I wanted the word that I use not to be so narrow as I believe racism is construed. I wanted it to encompass these broader barriers that we build and that make it more difficult for us to kind of create empathy across, the many different peoples that make it difficult for us to build an inclusive society.
Yeah.
Now, just one more thing, just to make sure, I'm not trying to draw an equivalence. So the racial hostility that shaped the United States into the country that is today was white Americans' racial hostility. So I'm not saying that everybody is kind of racist in the same sort of way and that it's all equally relevant. The racism and tribalism and fear and contempt and all that, the stuff, the one that matters, the one that has been in power, is white racial hostility. And so, to be sure, I think that is the one that is more troubling. That is the one that has shaped the U.S. into this society that I think is dystopian. But at the same time, I also think that the term has other kind of aspects to it. There's other margins to the notion of racial divisions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Nehemiah, one of the reasons I wanted to have you in this conversation was because of you're on kind of the front lines of everything that's been happening the last couple of weeks. And even like before this, I follow your work quite regularly, and, you were really talking a lot about COVID-19. Let's not forget that that's still with us right now. And you were talking about a lot of the inequities that exist in the pandemic. And seemed like that was really the focus of your attention for the last couple of months, really. And now, of course, you've really been dealing with everything that's going on the last couple of weeks on top of that stuff. When you're really busy, it's not a good, it seems like it's not a good thing because usually something bad is going on because you're having to be out there covering this stuff nonstop. What's it been like for you, kind of with all of this happening? I'm just curious to know. And people may think that the Black Wall Street Times is like 20 people working in a room. This is a pretty big undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, I have been extremely busy. I have been under a lot of stress, and things are still happening. But I think that when I sat down and actually read, I think it was the second chapter of his book today, it really lays out the foundation of why we're dealing with what we're dealing with right now. The disparities in COVID-19, the fact that since the pandemic hit, African-American unemployment soared over 50%. That's insane. But you look at the economic injustices that took place during, the late 1900s into the 20th century, which are laid out in this book, American Poison, and it really explains why we ended up where we are today.
Yeah. Eduardo, what we've often heard slavery be mentioned as America's original sin. That's a term that we've heard a lot. And once again, that's easy to kind of say that without knowing. I thought the New York Times podcast, the 1619 podcast, was just unbelievably powerful. And I learned so much from that. I'm sure you listened to that. But, it seemed like from beyond that, up until I'd heard that, it was like there was 1619, then there's the Civil War, and then there's now. And it was hard for me, to fill the gaps in a lot of those things. But that's, centuries in between of this kind of constant building of animus, of all these things that kind of got us to where we were. And you kind of dive into that. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a kind of 101 on kind of how you see this hostility and how it built over time?
Well, I think this hostility has been ever present. It's what's really very depressing is how little we have been able as a society to mitigate it, to kind of like change the emotional underpinning. But just thinking in terms of our history, I was really interested in the book to make this book about contemporary America. So I really wasn't interested in pre-Civil War US and how that played out, or in Reconstruction and Jim Crow. I mean, that's part of the origins, part of the roots of what we experience today. But I wanted to start in what made the US that we live in now. And so I decided that my best point to start was basically with the New Deal, which is kind of like the moment where the US begins to have a big state, where, the government starts really collecting some sort of significant taxes and starts creating certain programs. And so the government starts like having a much more deeper activity across society. And how then we decided that this government and that meant to kind of like protect, ensure, underpin the well-being of Americans was built around this notion of racial hostility, right? So to be sure, I mean, the roots are really deep, but, I only very briefly refer to Reconstruction and 13th and 14th Amendment and, how they were just after they were enacted, they were ultimately distorted and kind of ignored. But I acknowledge that is the foundation, but I was much more interested in building this, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st.
Do you view, one of the things that's really interesting about the book is how, there's no real heroes and everyone is kind of guilty across political spectrums. You talk about, Bill Clinton, for example, who was referred to as, the first Black president. You guys remember that famous quote about him. The welfare reform that happened under him, the crime bill, these are things that when you look back 25 odd 30 years and you see the kind of damage that those have wrought, it's hard to kind of look at that administration, right? Whether you're Democrat, Republican, and say that they had any real thought to how this would impact communities of color. I mean,
and it also, I think it speaks to the political alignment of the country, because look, I don't have any insight into Bill Clinton's feelings about people of color. My guess is that he was probably not a racist man, but his interpretation of the politics of his time led him to legislate stuff that was really pretty horrible to Blacks and also to Latinos. I mean, welfare reform, which is essentially about giving the responsibility of welfare back to the states, which we already knew had a horrible track record of dealing with African Americans, and the criminal justice legislation that was just doubling down on the proposal that managing society is about putting, the outcasts into prison, most of these outcasts being people of color. The political calculation behind this, to me, speaks more than it speaks about Bill Clinton. It speaks about the underlying political reality of this country, and how politicians have made this calculation time and time again. And that's very impressive.
That's interesting. And like Nehemiah, I've seen you kind of write about even Barack Obama and some policies that were there, and not saying you get a pass, right? These policies matter, right? The decisions we make matter, and there's some things like that, and that's not just Donald Trump and the Muslim ban and some of these things, which are very obvious. It's more like these day-to-day policies. Do you have any sense of something in the last 15, 20 years, this is directed at Nehemiah, that you kind of see as a moment where we could have, as a nation, pivoted in a way? It wasn't the moment when Barack Obama becomes elected where he could have there was that moment of about 3 months where everything was kind of there. They had the Congress, they had all these things. They could have made some major policy changes, but it seemed like there was a little bit of a fear of overreach, right? There was, didn't want to kind of seem like we were over-serving certain communities, right? But that would have been the time. Do you kind of see things like we lost an opportunity there?
I can't really say. And the only reason why I'm kind of like on the fence on my response to that question is because I feel like we were coming towards the edge for a long time. Like this big explosion that's taking place about the realities of racial injustice in this country. I think it's been boiling, and it just took a few more African Americans to be killed publicly for that energy to manifest. So,
yeah. I want to say a couple of things. If you guys see in your comments here, if you pick up a copy of American Poison tonight, I hope you do, because we're barely going to scratch the surface of this book. There's so much there. We're giving a percentage of those sales to the Terrence Quencher Foundation. And so now is the time to do that. It's important to support organizations like that and support things in our community. So just a little bit of a note there. This is something for both of you. I'd like to direct to both of you that has come up a lot in the last couple of days. And it's hard to explain, I guess, so I'll try my best, which is obviously the 3 or 4 stories that have been highlighting in the news have been with, Black Americans, right? But you've had conversations going on about Indigenous people. You've had conversations going on about the Latino culture. And some conversations have said we don't need to lump all these things together. This is a problem that's specifically targeted at Black Americans. And the weight of it is just so much different. We need to kind of deal with those as individual problems and not try to get everything in under that. Just curious for both of you how you respond to that and how you kind of think about that conversation.
Nehemiah, you want to give this a shot first?
Let's see. How do I do? I honestly feel like in the past, our country has always tried to, I guess, I would say in the past, and maybe even today, you know, when it comes to advocating for Black lives, there's always this notion that, oh, well, we need to just lump all people of color into you know, this movement just so it seems more equitable. And when those things happen, it takes away from centuries of economic injustice that African Americans have faced. I mean, you look at the data and the statistics, we're at the bottom of everything. And there's a reason why we're at the bottom, and it's because of the color of our skin. In the book, I know that Eduardo talks about, you know, how African Americans are kind of blocked out of being a part of these union movements, and how the unions actually worked against them to keep them from being hired and actually pulling in resources, financial resources, getting jobs. And, you know, that's what's happened today. You know, it's, as I had mentioned before, it's the boiling point of what happened back then and what's taking place now. So,
yeah, that's a great point. Eduardo, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I would have to agree with Nehemiah that the main, deepest, bloodiest wound in American society is a cleavage, is white violence against African Americans, for sure. That is the most painful wound of our kind of like racial divisions, of our racial hostility. I would, however, disagree on kind of like strategic and tactical grounds, and also perhaps on more kind of like ontological and conceptual grounds, is that I think that the ultimate objective of whatever fight it is against racism, against racial hostility, against racial barriers, has to be very ecumenical. It has to be about building a place for everybody. I don't think, and I'm not a kumbaya person at all. I am a deep pessimist. I'm not naturally drawn to, yes, let's all live together in happiness and think that's easy. But I do think that that's the only avenue that the US has right now available to it to build a society that is, you know, somehow more equitable and just. It has to include all of these groups. And so I do think that, you know, Latinos who've experienced, you know, a different form of racial violence and a different form of segregation and discrimination, which frankly I do see is not as fundamental as that that has been deployed against Blacks. But I think they have to be part of the solution, as I think that, you know, say Asian Americans and Native Americans have to be part of the conversation. So I really believe that the conversation has to be inclusive, because I think that the solution has to be inclusive. And so leaving out other communities, I don't think at the end of the day is helpful to advance the debate.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, you know, one of the big conversations that's going on is the kind of all lives matter, Black lives matter conversation. And all lives matter has really become this kind of veiled, somewhat, it's not even veiled anymore, but you can see that, you can almost see that response coming a mile away. But then on the other side of it, on the left side of it, you kind of hear this thing about what we're talking about, where we kind of need to kind of have all these causes lumped together. And in some ways, they're both sides of the same thing, where we're kind of losing focus on the main problem a little bit, you know, and by doing that, we're kind of blurring where we need to be. I don't know. It just seems like there's some friction there that I'm not sure how we've not quite figured out how to deal with that yet, you know.
Just to make sure, I'm not saying all lives matter. just
right. No, of course.
Absolutely clear.
Sounded like a little bit, but I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I think that we all want equity, and we all want equality for all Americans, no matter what race they are. And I think that the reason why I responded the way I did with that answer is because, you know, I see that there's an equity gap between the Black Lives Matter movement actually having importance in the conversation of overall race relations.
No, I'm totally with you on that. I think that's the first and foremost issue that we have to address. Yeah. But I think that we could move much more if there's Latinos walking alongside African Americans and there's Native Americans walking alongside them. I really think that's the only way, ultimately. And at the end, I also think that we need white folks in that march too. We do, because part of what I'm proposing in American Poison is that this society that we've built ultimately hurts white America too.
Right.
Can we talk for a minute about the role generations play in the overall problem? I was often thinking about this, when if you look at the baby boomers as a generation, right? They're the last living generation to have really seen kind of legalized segregation writ large throughout the country, even though they were maybe young people or children. And now, of course, you have, if you're 19, 20 years old, you've lived in a somewhat different world than that. It's been institutionalized, maybe not as black and white on a something outside of a restaurant or something. It's not been that thing. The problems still remain, though. But the levers of power in America are still run by people of a certain age or older. And talk about how you think that this problem can change as those things shift. I'm trying to say it in a way that means, do those people have to die off, I guess, to make the real changes? But is it going to take a cyclical change of power on that level to really make progress?
Nehemiah, do you want to go there first?
I think that you should definitely go for this one first.
Okay, because I'm a boomer here, so I hope we don't need me to keel over before this is fixed, and that would be so depressing. But no, I totally hear you. I do think that right now the most important political obstacle to the kind of change that I think that we need is older white voters. And my kind of analysis of what has driven the politics of the United States, for sure in the last 4 years, but also to some extent before, has been the politics of older white voters that are afraid of the moment 20 years down the line when they are no longer going to hold ultimate political power that they have held on since the birth of the nation. Mm. And, you look into the 2040s and, people of color are going to be the majority of the population. Non-Hispanic whites are going to be in the minority. And they see this too. And I think that is inspiring a lot of fear. And I do think it's generational fear. I mean, I hope it's generational fear. I hope that younger whites, especially urban younger whites, who have been more accustomed to living with other people, with people that are, Latino and Black and Asian and other, can come to understand society as something that is much more diverse, that includes so many more people. So I do think that if we are to have hope in this country, it's vested in that generation. Now, hopefully my generation doesn't have to die for that to happen.
Well, I mean, change has always come through these larger cycles. I mean, that's just the nature of things, because in some ways, I'm curious to hear how you both feel about this. And when you see the level of protest, it's of course disheartening because of the chaos it's creating in society, and people are getting hurt and they're out there, but it's an important time. But the sheer scope of it, we were talking before we jumped on here about protests happening in small rural communities throughout Oklahoma, which is something we were kind of surprised about. Yeah. That I don't think that would have happened if this had been televised in 1960. We have to, do you see some progress, at least in the response of people?
Well, the cards are kind of, yes. Immediately, yes. Just at looking at the composition of the protests.
Right.
it's much more representative of what America is right now. There's all sorts of people out in the street, and I think that's great. Now, let's see, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, I'm thinking in 1968, after Dr. King is killed, there were these massive protests in, hundreds of protests, some of which were quite violent. And there's been work. There's this dude, this political scientist at Princeton that has done this work finding that those protests actually moved moderate white voters who had voted for the Democratic Party in 1964 to support Richard Nixon in 1968.
This is the silent majority.
This is the silent majority, right? And I can tell that right now, President Trump is trying to play that same sort of card, presenting himself as, the law and order president, confronting these unruly masses that are willing to loot and maim out in cities across the country. Now, I think the proof will be in what happens in November. I mean, and I'm really hoping that the United States over the last 50 years have moved, and that this fear of, angry younger people of color protesting police brutality in the street does not lead them to vote to the other side. I am sort of optimistic about that, but I've been proven wrong before in this kind of optimism. And so
the demographics are way different than 1968. That's one thing. The second thing, of course, is Donald Trump has been president already for a few years. Nixon had not been president yet at that point. And then the third thing, I guess, would be that, it's interesting, not to get too specifically political, but one of the things when Joe Biden became he's not been totally, picked yet through the convention process, but once he kind of became the main person on that side, there was a lot of talk about youth vote. The moment the moment we're living in right now will probably do more to push the youth vote than anything that Joe Biden could have probably done during his campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds right to me. And just to put some reasons for pessimism in front of against your reasons for optimism, I have the sense that the vote, the conservative vote, the vote for reaction against this demographic change and against a change in our American society is more motivated now than it was even in the 60s. I mean, I think that what happens in the 60s is you have a lot of white voters that are repelled by the idea that African Americans have been invited in by the civil rights movement to participate in the bounty of American citizenship, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and so forth. And so there's a white reaction to that I think is powerful. I think right now you have the motivation by that political cohort is potentially more powerful because it's fear of being cast out of power. So I agree with you that the U.S. is different. We are a much more diverse country, and that is super powerful. But I also think that the kind of like the old white power is very motivated, and is motivated by fear, and fear is a very, very powerful force.
Nehemiah, I'm curious to know, where are the points that you are able to find some hope or optimism in these moments? We're living in such a chaotic and tough time, and you turn on the news and it's hard not to cry at what you see every day. Do you look to stats, to numbers, to people out in the streets fighting for what they believe in? Is it hard for you to kind of hold on to some sense of progress, or is that something that comes naturally?
Well, I mean, African Americans are resilient people, so we don't have a choice but to survive, and the only way we can survive is to have hope. But I'm kind of, I want to kind of go back to what Mr. Porter was saying. So, what do you think the election is panning up to it's pinning on to go? Do you think that Trump, there's a strong possibility, despite what the polls are saying, that Trump could be elected because of this racial hostility and this fear of 2040 or 2050 takeover of people of color?
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a risk. I'm not a pundit. I don't know. I was wrong in 2016, massively wrong. So I really have learned my lesson about forecasting this kind of stuff. But one thing that 2016 taught me was the power of these emotions that I really didn't quite understand as so powerful. So I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that we have learned a lesson and that things will go differently. But I'm sort of like recognize the power of this fear to motivate a section of the electorate that votes at a very, very high rate. Older people vote at a very, very high rate. White older people are perhaps the most likely to vote in the country. And so I don't want to dismiss that possibility. I look at the same polls that you do, and I know that they're looking the other way, but I also remember the polls in 2016.
Right.
Well, I think the one thing that's really interesting to me is, of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but we know that this will be used by Donald Trump as a tool, right? We know that it will be about law and order. It will be about restoring that. Things like, what happened in Minneapolis, where the city council recently just voted yesterday, I believe, to restructure their police force. I think it's been mislabeled by some as totally getting rid of it. It's not.
Yeah, getting rid of it, yeah.
But he will say they got rid of it, right? And the conversation will be, if you want chaos in your towns and you want to have no police force in your cities and towns, that you can see it happening now. So whether it works or not, you can see the campaign rhetoric being formed by that. Now, that's not to say that we need to change what we're doing just so he doesn't have tools to use, or either side. You shouldn't change your morals or your beliefs so you're not giving someone a tool against you. That doesn't seem that seems bankrupt morally to me. But we're in for a wild next few months. That's all we know for sure, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying, you can't say don't protest, right? Of course.
Yeah.
That's something to take, that's something that's going on, yeah.
But Nehemiah, I'm curious to talk a little bit about this. One of the things that I feel like is not brought up enough, and we'll come back to Eduardo about the economics, because obviously that's the place where you spend a lot of your time writing about. But Tulsa, to me, is such a segregated city still. I think there's a large percentage of our population in this city that go their whole day, most days, without interacting with any Black Tulsans, That may not be the case as much with Latino Tulsans but I think it's very simple to live in a part of Tulsa where you really don't have any interaction with the Black community. And that's been that way. I turned 40 this summer. It's been that way my whole life. And I've lived here most of my life. And I've not seen it get better. And that's one of the things that's most frustrating to me. And I don't know how to change it either. How do you talk about the kind of unseen, untalked about geographic problem that we still deal with here in Tulsa?
Yeah, so and from my personal perspective, I do think as far as social interactions, Tulsa is getting better when it comes to African Americans and white Tulsans, mixing around and hanging out. So I think that's something that I've noticed, especially since we're getting closer to the centennial of the 1921 massacre. But as far as economic justice, horrible. I mean, we have gone backwards. That's what's happened in Tulsa. And that's something that we don't talk about enough. We can talk about We can talk about social interactions and white folks and black folks sitting down to dinner tables and going to the movies and our kids going to school together. Like, that's great. But at the end of the day, what's going to sustain the community? Economic development is what's going to sustain the communities. And so the tentacles of white supremacy are controlling the finances in this city. When you look at how much money our city is putting into the police department versus how much they're putting into social economic development, it's very telling of, you know, who is being policed and who is being economically oppressed.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up on that a little bit more as to where we are and what we're doing, you've done such great work with Black Wall Street Times and other ventures that you've been involved with. Do you think that it seems like over the last 2 to 3 years, the conversations about, of course, the race massacre and everything have ramped up? And I think so many more people, not just here, I mean, we've talked about Watchmen and all these kind of pop cultural elements that have brought it to the forefront. Do you think that since we already had started some of those conversations, if none of that had been going on and we got to this point, were we prepared for any of this and kind of some of these conversations any better, having had the last 2 or 3 years of these conversations than we would have been if none of that had occurred? Nehemiah, I'm just curious what you think about that.
I think it has helped push the conversation forward for sure. And had we not had those films or even the excitement of the centennial, I think that socially we would definitely not be as far along as we are. So, and I think that there are a lot of people in the city who are white that are doing the work to you know, push the needle forward on these types of conversations.
Yeah. Eduardo, you know, I'd like to talk for a minute about economics. Obviously, that's your beat. And, you know, we talked about Bill Clinton earlier. You know, it's that famous line about if the economy's stupid, and economics play a huge role in this. And Nehemiah just brought that up about the inequities. You know, it can be all fun and games, you know, where we can hang out together, but if we're not equal on a base economic level, then nothing will really change. Did you what was your entry point for the book? Were you looking at it from that economic inequity point of view, since that's kind of your main focus usually? How did you kind of get this conversation going?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to bore you. It's kind of a long story, but I went into the book. My thought that took me into the book, I've lived most of my life outside of the United States. I returned to the US. I lived here when I was born here, and I lived here until I was 6, and then I left and I came back in my late 30s. And what struck me about this country was I felt a weird disconnect between this feeling that this is the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world, and it's really gives a crap deal to a real lot of Americans. So that is the thought that I chewed on and chewed on and chewed on. How can this country deal with so many of its people in this crummy way, allow such entrenched poverty, allow these horrible, social and health and psychological outcomes? And I won't, but if you compare the U.S. to other rich nations, we end up on the bottom of the ladder along so many of these social indicators that it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I actually first, before thinking of the book that's out to now, I had thought about a book that started that way. How does the U.S. create such a crap deal for its people? That was my first thought. But, I thought about it further, and I lived for some years in Los Angeles when I returned to the U.S. And in LA is a very segregated place too. You have the Mexicans and the Salvadorians and the African Americans and the Koreans. It's a very, very segregated world. And that's where I sort of like came along this line, this feeling that, you know, the reason that the US is so stingy to its people is because of you know, racism, racial hostility, racial contempt, racial fear, racial mistrust. That kind of like I landed on that. And there's a lot of economic research on it. There's, you know, so I rely a lot on the work of economists that have studied how these sorts of divisions affect our willingness to pay for the kind of social safety net and other public goods. And so that's basically, so it's an economic thought about why didn't we build the kind of safeguards that other countries built? And I landed on this, well, because of racial hostility.
Yeah.
Prevented us. And so that's sort of like the feeling. Now, on top of that, you have, as you point out, enormous economic inequities. I mean, this country layered on top of this inability to deliver these sorts of supports is we are one of the most unequal countries in the rich world. And this inequality also creates social distance, which also makes it even more difficult to build these notions of empathy and solidarity across borders. And so yeah, I mean, what started me down this line was this notion of this is a really strange country, extremely wealthy, but that tolerates a level of impoverishment that is unheard of.
Yeah. Nehemiah, you know, I mentioned earlier, we're getting a percentage of the book sales tonight to the Terrence Quencher Foundation, and we've been going through these last weeks. And of course, we have, you know, Terrence Quencher in some ways is our own moment that, you know, Minneapolis is going through. We've gone through that process. Some people may not know who Terrence Quencher was and what happened in that situation. Can you kind of recap that that incident and kind of tell us kind of where we are now, and also some of the parallels that you see as to what Tulsa did and went through there and what places like Minneapolis are doing now?
Right. So in 2016, in September, Terrence Quencher was, his car had broken down and he was on 36th Street North in Tulsa. There was a helicopter that was flying around, and he was allegedly given commands by Betty Shelby, who was with one of her partners. And Terrence had walked over towards the vehicle. His hands were up, and he was shot. And he was shot on live or national television. And he died right there on the scene. And when the officers actually went to the vehicle and they opened the door, it was Terrence's wallet that was on the dashboard. So I don't know if he was just trying to get his wallet so he could show his ID and identify himself, but he wasn't even given a chance to explain anything. The police officer that was in the helicopter had said that, you know, he looks like this is a big bad dude. So Terrence was judged before he even had a chance to have a trial, you know, himself. And, you know, the racial hostility that you mentioned certainly played out during the trial and even the months after he was shot until the trial.
Betty Shelby, you know, was not held accountable for that killing. She was interviewed, I guess it was an older interview on the CBS Sunday Morning piece they did yesterday. And you look at what's happening in Minnesota, Minneapolis, for example, you have to hope that, you know, one, we just have the tape is just very, I mean, seeing something from here, I mean, having that account on video, you have to think that there will be a different level of accountability, but then looking back to everything, even from Rodney King to Terrence Quencher, and there's been so many examples of justice not being delivered on that. And do you have any, it's hard to imagine that those officers would not be held accountable just based on what we've seen with our own eyes, but do you worry that justice will not be delivered even with what we've seen and what we know now?
So at this point in time, I do believe that there will be some kind of justice. I don't know what level of justice is going to be given to the criminals that held down Mr. Floyd and murdered him or lynched him in public today. But I tell you one thing, if it's not to the satisfaction of that family and to Black America, that it will be as bad as probably when MLK was assassinated in this country. And I think it will be longer than what we are experiencing now.
Yeah. Yeah. Eduardo, like I said at the beginning of our talk, having your book come out into this moment, of course, makes the book more relevant than ever. But, it's also, it's disheartening as an American kind of living in this moment. But, what do you hope that people will take away from the book, other than learning some things? But the book, you obviously have something you want to get across here and something that you're trying to say. Obviously, we want people to read the book, but what path do you want this to set people on? Because it just made me want to read much more about it, actually.
Okay. So if there's a purpose, it is for all of us to understand how much damage this has done to the social fabric of the country. There's a narrative that is true and powerful and should be told, that is, white American power has done enormous violence and enormous damage to Black people and Black communities. And I would also add that it is also done in different ways, and sometimes in similar ways, enormous damage to other communities of color. And I'm Latino, and I have maybe somewhat more knowledge about, but there's a lot of violence there too. And these are true stories, and they should be told, and they should be said again and again and again, and just made the argument that this is unjust, that this is not right. But I think that in order to work our way out as a country, as a commonwealth, as a people, the argument has to be made, has to be understood that this is hurting everybody, that it is hurting white America too. It is hurting all our institutions. It is making us, when I get really in the bad mood, I feel that it is turning us into a failed state. Where there is no sense of common purpose, where there is no sense of solidarity, where there's no sense of nation. And I think that the only solution that is sustainable, that is stable for a society, if we think that we want to be a same society 50 years from now, is by building this sense of empathy and solidarity that includes all Americans. And I think that argument is not made enough. And I think that Poison makes that argument. It makes the argument that, the white guy from Kentucky that opposes Medicaid because he or she feels that it is abused by people of color that are undeserving is hurting him or herself, because she also depends on this, on a generous state. And understanding that will help us kind of like build the notion that we have to be one nation. And I hate it because it sounds so naive, but I also don't see another out.
I agree.
My last question to both of you would be, what makes this moment different, right? We had Rodney King. We thought that would change something. It obviously didn't change much. We had Ferguson, right? It's been years now. It seemed like in the aftermath of that moment, we would have some larger, structural changes. Didn't seem like that solved the problem. The scope of this seems much bigger. Maybe that's in some way how you can tell it's going to be different. But do you think I'll start with Nehemiah, maybe Eduardo can finish. Do you think that this is a different moment than the things we've seen in the past? And if so, what makes it different, and how will it kind of end differently than the other situations?
Right. So I think that what makes it different this time is that we have a lot of white people that are marching for Black lives, and that is a huge that does give me hope. That we have African Americans, we have white Americans, that we have indigenous Americans and Latinx Americans all marching together for a single call, and that is for for justice and police reforms. So there won't be this disproportionate effect on Black lives.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to agree with Nehemiah. I think that is the thing to grab onto. That's the strand that allows for some optimism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to say a huge thank you to my partner in crime, Nehemiah, for joining me and having this conversation. I know he's very busy with everything that's going on. I want to say a big thank you to Eduardo for the time. I also thank you for the book. It really sparked a ton of important thoughts for me. I hope you all will take time to read it, get a copy. There are links here to do that. And let's keep the conversation going. We plan to have a lot more conversations about this topic as we move forward, and not just doing it for the next month or two, but just as a constant reminder to things we need to be paying attention to in our community. So thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Nehemiah. And thank you, everyone, for watching, for all your questions. We had so many in comments. We couldn't get through all of them, but please read the book, start conversation in your own community, start book clubs around this book, read other books. There have been so many great lists around about how you can kind of get started if you don't know where to start on these kind of things. Thank you guys so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Nehemiah. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.